Welcome to the Desert of Maine, a place I used to call home almost 100 years ago. This was in the 1930s when automobiles were still newfangled machines chugging down brand new highways. Oh, lots of tourists wanted to come here back then, and some of them stopped just up the road to see me first, the Hermit of Maine. After visiting my little cabin, they made their way to the desert, wondering what in the world happened to create this strange piece of land. Well, they learned a thing or two, but none of those folks heard the whole story. I'm here to tell it to you now. So listen up. The story of the Desert of Maine starts at many different places in time, depending upon where you slice it. If we go back 27,000 years ago, I can show you a giant ice sheet that spread from Canada through Maine and all the way south to Cape Cod. Skip forward to 13,000 years ago, and you'll see the Wabanaki beginning to live here in what we now call Freeport. As you can imagine, things looked pretty different back then. This was a land inhabited by giant beavers living in bogs the size of a whole town. There were mastodons and woolly mammoth, and perhaps even an occasional saber-toothed tiger roaming the area. But believe it or not, the terrain looked much the same as it does now. You see, glaciers pulverize rocks and boulders as they creep along their path, and some of the very finest sand particles made during the advance and retreat of ice sheets started blowing around. With not many tall trees to block the wind, the large deposits of extra soft, powdery sand settled right here. Dunes formed, and then moss and other plants began to grow and hold the blowing sands in place. Little by little, topsoil was created and a forest grew. Before long, the original glacier sand deposit was hidden from sight. Keep traveling with me up until the period of around the time of the Civil War, when this land had become the Tuttle family farm. Brothers James and Peter Tuttle farmed the land together, and one day they noticed something out in a field, a patch of sand the size of a dinner plate. At first, they didn't make much of it. Maine soil is sandy after all, but as time went on, they spotted more of these patches, and they were dismayed when sand started spreading and gradually took over their once fertile farmland. They came to regret their decision to raise hundreds of sheep because those little devils grazed very close, eating grass right down to the soil. Before they knew it, the Tuttle family had uncovered the sand from the Ice Age, and they ended up creating Maine's very own little dust bowl. Locals called this abandoned Tuttle farm the Sand Farm, and folks would come here to watch the shifting sand and enjoy a picnic. One day, they'd see the last of the Tuttle's apple trees were buried under the sand, and the next time they came, those trees would be uncovered again. There were a lot of shenanigans that happened after dark, especially during the Prohibition times. You see, our youth would come for an evening of wholesome prayer and contemplation. And wouldn't you know it, one night, the farmhouse burned down, all except the barn. Who knows what would have happened to this place if it hadn't been for the enterprising young man named Henry Goldrup. Henry knew he'd chanced upon an opportunity of a lifetime when he bought the abandoned Tuttle farm for $400. The year was 1925, and he understood that if those tourists coming from the south knew about this strange and wondrous place, they would surely be willing to shake a couple of dimes out of their pockets to see it. He sweetened the deal with homemade ice cream, hot dogs, and popcorn, and he held his visitors enthralled with walking tours that could go on for hours. Man, that guy could talk. It was Henry who called the place the Desert of Maine. But Henry was also a family man, and what you might call a naturalist. In 1936, a businessman by the name of Mark Palakkowicz made Henry an offer he couldn't refuse. Mark took over the operations of the desert, which left Henry time in the summers to hunt, fish, and relax with his family. Mark had heard about Henry's family attraction, but he believed he could make it even more famous. He added a spring house where fresh water gushed out of the sand. He brought in live camels. And he advertised big time. You'd think the desert was a circus. In a way, he made it one. Well, sadly, Mark hadn't been at it long when he died of a heart attack. That left his wife Van and 2 daughters, Elaine and Marvis, with a complicated and unusual business to run. But you better believe those Palakkowicz ladies could run a business at least as well as their old pops could. There was never a dull moment with Elaine Palakkowicz at the helm. She would have run the desert for the rest of her days, but eventually the Goldrups took over again. Henry, older and wiser, but talkative as ever, was thrilled to be back in his desert, telling visitors the secrets of the land. Henry ran his desert for 10 more years thereabouts when he took sick. They say that the last thing he gazed upon in this world was a photo of his beloved desert. And now, if you want to wander the desert like I am, you'll notice that it's shrinking. Over the last 80 years, the desert has reclaimed about 85 acres. Don't cry. That just means that this big skin knee on the land is healing itself up, one little tree and patch of moss at a time. Now, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me, but if you want to make an old hermit happy, open your ears and hearts and listen to the sand, the moss, the birds, and most of all, my friends, the trees.